In the winter of 1840, a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Hayes made a discovery that would expose one of the most twisted religious scandals in American history. While seeking shelter from a fierce snowstorm in the abandoned Blackwood Theological College, deep in the Virginia mountains, Hayes stumbled upon a hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar. Inside, he found the skeletal remains of 23 young men arranged in a grotesque prayer circle, each clutching a cross made from human bone. The discovery would unravel a 17-year conspiracy of murder, religious fanaticism, and betrayal that had claimed the lives of 89 aspiring ministers. The perpetrators had transformed their sacred institution into what authorities would later describe as a theological slaughterhouse, where faith became a weapon and salvation came at the cost of human lives. Before we delve deeper into this chilling tale of religious extremism gone wrong, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the darkest true stories from America's forgotten past. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these exclusive investigations. And tell me in the comments, have you ever encountered a place that gave you an unexplainable feeling of dread? I love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's uncover how a college meant to train God's servants became the site of one of history's most disturbing religious murders. Blackwood Theological College stood like a dark monument to religious devotion in the remote Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, some 60 miles southwest of Charlottesville. Founded in 1823 by the charismatic Reverend Ezekiel Blackwood, the institution was designed to train ministers for the growing Methodist congregations spreading across the American frontier. The college occupied a commanding position atop Revelation Ridge, a name that Blackwood claimed came to him in a divine vision. The main building, constructed of local gray stone, featured a towering chapel with stained glass, windows depicting scenes of divine judgment and redemption. Reverend Ezekiel Blackwood was a man of imposing presence and fierce conviction. Standing, nearly 7 feet tall, with piercing gray eyes and a wild mane of black hair that he never cut, claiming it was a sign of his covenant with God, Blackwood commanded both respect and fear from those who encountered him. Born in the mountains of West Virginia to a family of frontier preachers, he had experienced what he described as a series of divine revelations that revealed to him the true nature of salvation and the coming judgment of God. Blackwood's theological teachings were considered radical, even by the standards of frontier Christianity. He preached that the end times were imminent, and that God had chosen him to prepare a select group of ministers who would lead the faithful through the tribulation. According to Blackwood's interpretation of Scripture, only those who had been purified through trial could truly serve God's purpose. This purification process, he claimed, required the elimination of all worldly attachments and the complete surrender of one's will to divine authority. The college attracted young men from across the South and Midwest, particularly those from poor farming families who saw the ministry as their path to respectability and purpose. These students, many of whom had worked grueling jobs to save money for their religious education, were drawn by Blackwood's reputation as a powerful preacher and his promise of training that would prepare them for the spiritual battles of the last days. The institution's daily routine was rigid and demanding. Students rose at 4 a.m. for morning prayers, followed by hours of biblical study, theological instruction, and physical labor that Blackwood claimed was necessary for spiritual discipline. The curriculum focused heavily on prophecy, divine judgment, and the identification of spiritual purity. Students were taught to recognize the signs of divine favor and to understand their role as instruments of God's will. What made Blackwood Theological College particularly appealing to aspiring ministers was its emphasis on practical spiritual training. While other seminaries focused on academic theology, Blackwood insisted that his students experience direct encounters with the divine. The college's chapel was the center of these spiritual exercises, where students participated in intense prayer sessions, fasting rituals, and what Blackwood called trials of faith, designed to test their spiritual readiness. The surrounding mountain community had mixed feelings about the college. While local merchants benefited from the business it brought, many residents were disturbed by the strange sounds that emanated from the campus at night and the increasingly gaunt appearance of the students. Several families reported that their sons had stopped writing home after enrolling at Blackwood, claiming they were too focused on their spiritual development to maintain worldly correspondence. However, beneath this veneer of religious devotion, something far more sinister was taking root. Blackwood's concept of purification had evolved into something that bore no resemblance to Christian doctrine. He had begun to believe that certain students were spiritually contaminated and posed a threat to the purity of his chosen ministers. These students, he claimed, had to be eliminated to prevent them from corrupting the others and interfering with God's plan for the last days. The first signs of trouble at Blackwood Theological College emerged in the autumn of 1824, barely a year after the institution's founding. Joshua Miller, a 20-year-old from a farming family in Kentucky, simply vanished during what should have been his final month of study. According to college records, Joshua had been struggling with what Blackwood described as spiritual contamination and had been selected for special purification rituals to cleanse his soul before ordination. The circumstances of Joshua's disappearance were unusual from the beginning. His roommate, David Crawford, later recalled that Joshua had seemed increasingly agitated in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, speaking of strange visions and expressing fear about the purification process. On the night of October 13th, 1824, Joshua was summoned to the chapel for what Blackwood described as a final trial of faith. He never returned to his dormitory. When David reported Joshua missing the following morning, Reverend Blackwood personally addressed the inquiry. He explained that Joshua had indeed undergone the purification trial, but had been found spiritually unworthy of ordination. According to Blackwood, Joshua had been possessed by demonic influences that made him a danger to the other students. The young man had been exorcised and, overcome by shame at his spiritual failure, had fled into the mountains during the night. Blackwood assured the concerned students that Joshua's departure, while tragic, was evidence of God's protection over the college. He claimed that the Lord had revealed Joshua's spiritual corruption before he could contaminate other students or be ordained as a minister. The incident, Blackwood preached, demonstrated the necessity of rigorous spiritual testing and the wisdom of God's selection process. What made Joshua's disappearance particularly troubling was the college's response when his family arrived seeking answers. Joshua's father, a Methodist circuit rider who had sacrificed years of earnings to send his son to theological college, became increasingly desperate when he found no trace of his son in the surrounding mountains. Blackwood met with the family in the college's reception hall, his towering presence dominating the room as he repeated his explanation of Joshua's spiritual failure and flight. When Joshua's mother asked to see her son's belongings, Blackwood explained that all possessions of spiritually contaminated students were burned to prevent the spread of demonic influence. The family's attempts to search the mountains proved futile, and local authorities, influenced by Blackwood's reputation and the college's standing in the community, conducted only a cursory investigation. The truth about Joshua Miller's fate was far more horrific than anyone could have imagined. The young man had indeed been summoned to the chapel for a purification ritual, but instead of spiritual cleansing, he had encountered what Blackwood called divine judgment. In the hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar, Joshua had been subjected to what Blackwood described as a sacred execution. designed to prevent his spiritual contamination from spreading to other students. The ritual had been conducted by Blackwood himself, assisted by 2 faculty members who had been convinced that they were carrying out God's will. Joshua had been bound to a wooden cross and subjected to a prolonged ceremony that combined elements of exorcism, trial, and execution. Blackwood claimed that during the ritual, God had confirmed Joshua's spiritual corruption and commanded his death as a sacrifice to protect the purity of the college. The method of execution was designed to appear as a divine judgment rather than murder. Joshua was slowly suffocated using a technique that Blackwood claimed had been revealed to him in a vision. The process involved a gradual constriction of breathing using consecrated cloth, allowing the victim to remain conscious long enough to confess their sins and accept their fate. Blackwood believed that this method allowed the spiritually contaminated to achieve a form of redemption through their death. Following the execution, Joshua's body was placed in the hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar, where it was arranged in a position of prayer as part of what Blackwood called a congregation of the purified. The chamber had been constructed during the college's founding and was accessible only through a concealed entrance behind the altar. According to Blackwood's twisted theology, the bodies of the executed students would serve as guardians of the college's spiritual purity. The success of this first purification established a pattern that would define Blackwood's operation for the next 16 years. He had discovered that his position as a religious authority gave him complete control over his students' lives and deaths. More importantly, he had created a theological framework that justified murder as a form of divine service, allowing him to eliminate students while maintaining his reputation as a man of God. The selection process for victims became increasingly sophisticated over the years. Blackwood developed what he called spiritual diagnostics that allowed him to identify students who were allegedly contaminated by demonic influences. These diagnostics involved intense psychological manipulation designed to create fear and confusion that would make students more susceptible to his influence. Students who were identified as spiritually contaminated were gradually isolated from their peers and subjected to special instruction designed to prepare them for purification. This process typically took several weeks and involved intensive counseling sessions where Blackwood would convince the student that they were fighting a spiritual battle for their soul. The isolation and psychological pressure made it almost impossible for students to resist when they were finally summoned for their final trial. The hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar was expanded and improved over the years. What had begun as a simple storage space was transformed into an elaborate ritual chamber decorated with religious symbols and furnished with implements that Blackwood claimed were necessary for the purification process. The chamber contained multiple wooden crosses, ceremonial knives, and containers for collecting what Blackwood described as sanctified remains. The theological justification for the murders became increasingly complex and elaborate. Blackwood developed an entire system of beliefs that portrayed the executions as a form of divine service. He claimed that God had chosen him to identify and eliminate spiritually contaminated individuals before they could spread their corruption to others. The murders were not crimes, according to Blackwood's theology, but acts of divine mercy that prevented the victims from committing greater sins and protected the spiritual purity of the college. By 1830, 7 years after Joshua Miller's murder, Blackwood had killed 34 students and had begun to expand his operation. The college's reputation for producing exceptionally devout ministers had grown, and applications for admission increased dramatically. This success provided Blackwood with a larger pool of potential victims and allowed him to become more selective in his targeting. The psychological impact of the murders extended far beyond the actual victims. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Blackwood had created affected every student at the college. Young men lived in constant anxiety about their spiritual worthiness and the possibility of being selected for purification. Many students reported having nightmares about the chapel and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when entering the building. The first serious threat to Blackwood's operation came in the summer of 1831, when Reverend Matthew Harrison, a Methodist circuit rider from Tennessee, arrived at the college to investigate concerns raised by several families whose sons had supposedly abandoned their studies. Harrison, a veteran preacher with extensive experience in frontier ministry, had been contacted by more than a dozen families whose sons had supposedly left Blackwood Theological College under mysterious circumstances. Reverend Harrison's investigation began with a careful review of the cases. In each instance, the missing student had been described as spiritually troubled in the weeks before their disappearance. Each student had supposedly left the college suddenly, often during the middle of the night, without saying goodbye to roommates or friends. Most disturbingly, each family had received a letter from Blackwood explaining their son's departure, but none had received direct communication from the students themselves. When Harrison arrived at Blackwood Theological College, he was greeted by the imposing figure of Reverend Blackwood, who expressed understanding for the preacher's concerns and offered full cooperation with his investigation. Blackwood explained that the pressures of theological education were severe and that many young men from rural families found the spiritual demands overwhelming. He pointed out that the college's high standards, while producing exceptional ministers, also resulted in a higher rate of student departures than might be seen at less rigorous institutions. Harrison's interviews with current students revealed a troubling pattern of fear and anxiety. Several young men described feeling constantly watched and evaluated by faculty members. Others mentioned strange sounds coming from the chapel late at night and an overwhelming sense of dread when entering the building. Most significantly, several students described feeling that some of their classmates had seemed frightened in the days before their supposed departures. The circuit rider's investigation took a more serious turn when he attempted to examine the college's records and facilities. When Harrison requested to see documentation of the missing students' academic performance and disciplinary issues, Blackwood became evasive and claimed that such records were confidential. When the preacher asked to examine the chapel and other college facilities, Blackwood initially refused, citing the sacred nature of the spaces and the need to protect ongoing religious activities. Harrison's most disturbing discovery came when he attempted to contact families of students who had supposedly left the college in previous years. Using his connections with Methodist congregations throughout the South, he was able to locate several families who had never received any communication from their sons after the initial notification from Blackwood. These families had spent years wondering about their sons' fates, and many had attempted to locate them through various means, but had never found any trace of the young men. The investigation might have exposed Blackwood's operation if not for the preacher's decision to confront Blackwood directly about his suspicions. During a heated meeting in Blackwood's office, Harrison accused the college president of hiding information about the missing students and demanded a complete inspection of the campus facilities. This confrontation convinced Blackwood that Harrison posed a direct threat to his operation and had to be eliminated. On the night of August 15, 1831, Reverend Harrison was invited to attend a special evening service in the college chapel. Blackwood told him that he had decided to be completely transparent about the college's spiritual practices and that the service would demonstrate the purification rituals that had been the subject of Harrison's investigation. The circuit rider, believing that he was finally going to uncover the truth about the missing students, agreed to attend. The service in the chapel was unlike anything Harrison had ever experienced. The building was filled with students and faculty members, all dressed in white robes and carrying candles. Blackwood led the gathering in prayers and hymns that seemed to focus on themes of judgment, purification, and sacrifice. As the service progressed, Harrison began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the intensity of the proceedings and the fanatical devotion displayed by the participants. The climax of the service came when Blackwood announced that God had revealed to him the presence of a spiritual contamination that threatened the college's purity. He claimed that the Lord had identified the source of this contamination and commanded its removal. As Harrison watched in horror, Blackwood pointed directly at him and declared that the visiting preacher was an agent of Satan sent to corrupt the students and interfere with God's work. What followed was a scene of religious hysteria that would have been unbelievable if not for the testimonies of the students who witnessed it. The entire congregation, convinced by Blackwood's charismatic leadership and months of psychological manipulation, turned on Harrison with fanatical fury. The circuit rider was seized by students and faculty members who believed they were carrying out divine judgment. Harrison was dragged to the hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar, where he was subjected to the same purification ritual that had claimed the lives of 34 students over the previous 8 years. The process was more elaborate than usual, as Blackwood wanted to demonstrate to his followers the proper method for eliminating spiritual contamination. The circuit rider was bound to a wooden cross and subjected to a prolonged ceremony that combined elements of trial, exorcism, and execution. The murder of Reverend Harrison marked a significant escalation in Blackwood's criminal activities. Unlike the students who had been his previous victims, Harrison was a respected preacher with connections throughout the Methodist community. His disappearance would be investigated more thoroughly, and his failure to return from his visit to the college would raise questions that could not be easily dismissed. To cover their tracks, Blackwood and his followers created an elaborate story about Harrison's departure. They claimed that the circuit rider had been exposed as a false preacher who had been corrupted by worldly influences. According to their story, Harrison had been overcome by the power of their purification rituals and had fled into the mountains rather than face the revelation of his spiritual contamination. The success of the Harrison murder convinced Blackwood that he could eliminate any threat to his operation, regardless of the victim's status or connections. This confidence led him to become increasingly bold in his activities and to expand the scope of his purification program. Over the next 9 years, he would kill 55 more students, refining his methods and developing an even more elaborate theological justification for his crimes. The psychological impact of Harrison's murder on the college community was profound. Students who had witnessed the ritual were convinced that they had participated in a divine judgment, and their fanatical devotion to Blackwood increased dramatically. The college became even more isolated from the outside world, as students were taught to view all external influences as potential sources of spiritual contamination. The hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar was expanded, again to accommodate the growing number of bodies. What had begun as a simple storage space had evolved into a macabre shrine where the remains of 89 victims were arranged in elaborate patterns that reflected Blackwood's twisted theology. The chamber contained multiple prayer circles, each composed of skeletal remains positioned to face a central altar where Blackwood conducted his rituals. The theological framework that justified the murders became increasingly complex and divorced from any recognizable form of Christianity. Blackwood developed detailed doctrines about spiritual contamination, divine judgment, and the role of purification in preparing for the end times. These beliefs were taught to students as fundamental truths, creating a closed system of thought that made it almost impossible for anyone within the college to question Blackwood's authority or methods. By 1840, Blackwood Theological College had become a completely isolated cult, centered around the worship of its founder and the practice of ritual murder. The institution bore no resemblance to a legitimate theological school, despite maintaining the facade of religious education. Students were selected not for their academic potential or spiritual calling, but for their vulnerability to psychological manipulation and their suitability as victims for Blackwood's purification rituals. The end of Blackwood's reign of terror came not through investigation or exposure, but through a combination of natural disaster and human curiosity. The harsh winter of 1840 had been particularly severe, with heavy snows and bitter cold that made travel through the mountains almost impossible. The college had been completely cut off from the outside world for months, and supplies were running dangerously low. The extreme conditions had taken their toll on the college community. Several students had died from exposure and malnutrition, and others had begun to question Blackwood's claims about divine protection. The atmosphere of fear and fanaticism that had sustained the operation for 17 years began to crack under the pressure of survival. The decisive moment came when a fire broke out in the college's main building during a particularly violent storm. The blaze, caused by overheated stoves and poor ventilation, spread rapidly through the wooden interior of the stone building. Students and faculty members fled into the night, leaving behind everything except their lives. Blackwood himself perished in the fire, trapped in his office by falling debris as he attempted to retrieve what he called his sacred writings, the detailed records of his murders and theological justifications. His death marked the end of the systematic killing that had defined the college's existence, but it also meant that many of the operation's secrets would remain hidden. The surviving students, left leaderless and facing starvation in the mountains, began to make their way to nearby settlements. Their stories of life at the college were initially dismissed as the ravings of traumatized survivors, but the consistency of their accounts and the physical evidence they described gradually convinced authorities that something terrible had occurred at Blackwood Theological College. The discovery of the hidden chamber beneath the chapel altar came several months later, when Reverend Samuel Hayes sought shelter from a snowstorm in the ruins of the college. Hayes, a traveling preacher who had been making his way through the mountains, found the concealed entrance while exploring the damaged chapel. What he discovered in the chamber below would haunt him for the rest of his life. The chamber contained the skeletal remains of 89 victims, arranged in the grotesque prayer circles that Blackwood had created over 17 years of systematic murder. The bones showed evidence of the ritualistic nature of the killings, with many skulls bearing marks from the ceremonial knives that had been used in the purification process. The chamber also contained Blackwood's ritual implements, religious artifacts, and remnants of the white robes that victims had been forced to wear during their executions. Hayes's discovery led to a comprehensive investigation that would expose the full scope of Blackwood's crimes. Authorities found evidence that 89 young men had been murdered at the college between 1824 and 1840, making it one of the most prolific serial killing operations in American history. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Blackwood had corrupted his students and faculty, turning them into willing participants in his murderous enterprise. The surviving students were interviewed extensively, and their testimonies painted a picture of systematic brainwashing and psychological manipulation that had transformed a religious institution into a death cult. Many of the survivors required years of counseling to overcome the trauma of their experiences and to understand that they had been victims of a criminal enterprise rather than participants in divine judgment. The investigation revealed disturbing details about the selection and murder of victims. Blackwood had maintained detailed records of each student's psychological profile, identifying those who were most vulnerable to manipulation and most likely to be missed if they disappeared. The records showed that he had specifically targeted students from poor families who would be unable to investigate their sons' disappearances thoroughly. The theological writings that Blackwood had developed to justify his crimes were studied by religious scholars who were horrified by the systematic perversion of Christian doctrine. The writings revealed a mind that had twisted fundamental concepts of faith, salvation, and divine justice into a framework that justified murder as a form of religious service. The documents became important evidence in understanding how religious authority could be corrupted and used to manipulate vulnerable individuals. The families of the 89 victims faced the difficult task of understanding what had happened to their sons and finding some measure of closure. Many had spent years wondering about their sons' fates, and the revelation of the truth brought a mixture of relief and horror. The identification of remains was challenging, but forensic experts were able to match several sets of bones to missing students based on dental records and personal effects found in the chamber. The impact on the broader religious community was profound and lasting. The Blackwood case led to increased scrutiny of religious institutions and demands for greater oversight of theological education. Many denominations implemented new policies designed to prevent the kind of isolation and extremism that had enabled Blackwood's crimes. The site of Blackwood Theological College was abandoned and never rebuilt. Local residents reported that the ruins remained cursed, with strange sounds and unexplained phenomena occurring for decades after the discovery of the murders. Whether these reports reflected genuine supernatural activity or simply the psychological impact of the horrific crimes that had occurred, there remains a matter of speculation. The case established important precedents for the prosecution of religious crimes and the protection of students in educational institutions. The Blackwood murders demonstrated how charismatic leaders could use religious authority to manipulate and exploit vulnerable individuals, leading to increased awareness of the dangers of religious extremism and cult-like behavior. The psychological impact on the survivors continued for years after the investigation concluded. Many of the students who had witnessed the murders struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion about their participation in what they had believed were religious rituals. Some left the ministry entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the horrors they had experienced. The documentation found in the hidden chamber provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the mind of a religious killer and the methods used to manipulate and control victims. The detailed records that Blackwood had maintained became crucial evidence in understanding how systematic murder could be disguised as religious practice and how entire communities could be convinced to participate in criminal activities. The preservation of the crime scene allowed forensic experts to study the ritualistic aspects of the murders in detail. The arrangement of the bodies and the religious artifacts found in the chamber provided valuable information about the psychological motivations behind the killings and the extent to which Blackwood had developed his murderous theology. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of young men seeking religious education in isolated institutions. Many of the victims had been drawn to Blackwood Theological College by genuine faith and a desire to serve God, only to find themselves trapped in a system that exploited their devotion and ultimately cost them their lives. The financial investigation revealed that Blackwood had accumulated significant wealth through the operation of his murderous enterprise. Unlike other criminal operations, the college had not been motivated by monetary gain, but by the twisted religious beliefs of its founder. The lack of financial motive made the case even more disturbing, as it demonstrated how ideology could be used to justify systematic murder. The international implications of the case were limited, as the murders had been contained within the isolated mountain community. However, the case did lead to increased communication between religious institutions and law enforcement agencies, as authorities recognized the need for better oversight of religious education and the protection of students in isolated settings. The Blackwood Theological College murders remain one of the most chilling examples of how religious authority can be corrupted and used to justify unspeakable crimes. The case serves as a reminder of the importance of questioning authority, maintaining oversight of institutions, and protecting vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit their faith for criminal purposes. This dark chapter in American religious history shows us how quickly institutions meant to serve God can become instruments of evil when placed in the hands of those who prioritize their own twisted beliefs over human life. The story of Blackwood Theological College reminds us that vigilance and accountability are essential to preventing such tragedies from occurring again. What do you think about this horrifying tale of religious extremism? Do you believe there might be other institutions with similar dark secrets hidden in America's past? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as chilling as I did, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more dark mysteries. From our nation's forgotten history, the past holds many secrets, and some of them are more terrifying than we could ever imagine. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and remember that the truth is often stranger and more frightening than fiction.